So to begin, I'd like to express my gratitude for being here. It's hard to understate that. To preface, to say that I'm a fan of Mr. Buckley is to do a disservice to the word fan. I've got Buckley posters, T-shirts, magnets. It's actually kind of pathetic. But like myself, Bill was what could only be described as a Shiite Catholic, and it is to those instincts that I direct this proposal. As conservatives, I think we rightly hold dear the uniquely American promise of freedom and liberty. And as a people who love liberty, I have to wonder about what that promise means for a person with profound intellectual or developmental disabilities. I grew up down the road from this mammoth 1,600-acre institution for the disabled. Its campus always charmed me with its elegant architectural facades and sprawling bucolic landscapes. It was in some ways an encapsulation of the serene rural quiet that I loved about my hometown in Southbury, Connecticut. But it wasn't until I began volunteering with these folks and their families at the Southbury Training School that I really saw the way that so-called advocates who claimed to speak on behalf of the entire population of disabled people had so completely missed the mark about what was going on there. This proposal that I'm presenting today is not particularly unpopular, impractical, or even all that radical in truth, but what it is unfashionable. Fashionable people, we all know them, the ones who hold all of the socially prescribed positions on domestic politics and lecture all their dissenters in stark moral terms, they unilaterally despise this idea. But as conservatives, we are, if nothing else, comfortable with being unfashionable. In the state of Connecticut, there are over 2,000 individuals with developmental disabilities with nowhere to go. That's a bit of an abstraction, so let me materialize for a moment what that looks like. Imagine a 6-foot, 215-pound, 35-year-old man with the mental acumen of a 2-year-old child, who, if left to his own devices, would attempt to swallow inedible objects. There are individuals like this in the state of Connecticut, and it is their parents, often aging and increasingly hopeless, who are forced to do the impossible, care for a person with this profound of a disability in their home. And why? Because in part of a movement called the inclusion movement. It is one of those Orwellian progressive phrases that are impossible to oppose without sounding like some sort of psychopath. Oh, you're against inclusion? You sound like a wonderful human being. The so-called inclusion movement, touted relentlessly by the Obama administration, claims that every person with disabilities, irrespective of the profundity of that disability, can function, quote, in the community. You're not allowed to question that, by the way. And while it's true, of course, that some or many persons with disabilities can function quite well in the community, using your common sense, do you in your heart of hearts really believe, that every disabled person in the state of Connecticut is capable of bagging groceries all day, coming home, and living in a residential property in your neighborhood? Some, certainly, but all? Every single one? No is likely your answer. You might think for some or even most disabled people, supported community living is a fine arrangement, but that there are some levels of need that are so high that a more structured and intense care environment are needed. Many of the disabled could live in community arrangements, but the state's more profoundly disabled could live in a place like the Southbury Training School that can better care for their needs. But like all ideologues, crusaders in the inclusion movement have been forced to rebrand common sense as verboten. Consider the frustrated experience of Joe Barker, whose 40-year-old son has suffered from profound developmental delays all of his life. Quote, "Is inclusion a cause that must be served whether or not it is appropriate for a specific child? In the mad dash to close institutions and many other specialized programs for people with disabilities, the people directly affected by those closures were rarely asked their opinion early enough in the process to make a difference. Instead, advocacy groups, especially those that receive federal funding to promote their causes, claimed to represent people with disabilities and swooped in with all the answers. No one would choose to live in an institution or a group home, work at a sheltered workshop, attend a day program with other persons with disabilities, or live anywhere but in their own home or at home with their family. All people with disabilities can and should live independently, make all their own decisions, and work in integrated, competitive work environments. The truth is that there are people with disabilities who can do some of these things, some who can do none of them, and some who choose to do things differently than other persons with similar disabilities. They have been marginalized," end quote. The truth is that there are people with, I'm repeating there. Like all ideological undertakings, there are flesh and blood costs to misapplied idealism. It is these victims for whom I offer the following proposal. In an environment where over 2,000 adult children are on a waiting list to enter group homes, eligible for home and community-based settings waivers, HCBS, I propose reopening the Southbury Training School to new admissions. This would require overturning the 1986 state appropriations bill that prevented the facility from accepting new residents. I additionally suggest utilizing existing campus infrastructure as a community resource center for persons with developmental delays across the state, wherever they live. The proposal is indeed to give families a choice, not a mandate, to send their now adult children wherever they'd like, based on the profundity of the adult child's disability. Since the early 20th century, most of the state's populations of disabled persons lived in institutions anyway, long before the term was turned into an epithet, in either state training schools or regional centers that served much the same function. Care in these facilities was largely quite good. The Southbury Training School in particular was considered a model for others of its ilk. But like every other facility in the mid-20th century, Southbury struggled with overcrowding and understaffing. The Mansfield Training School, one of the state's 2 training schools, along with some of the regional centers, closed in the late 20th century as community living, small 4 to 5 person private group facilities, became an alternative to the institutional model. This model was efficacious for some, primarily higher functioning persons with disabilities, who were physically and emotionally able to handle community living. But such a move was not for everyone, and not everyone left institutional settings. The Southbury Training School, which once housed a population of over 2,000, has been reduced to a patient population of just below 220, and those who remain comprise the most profoundly handicapped of Connecticut's intellectually and developmentally disabled residents. Southbury was built in the early 1940s as a training school for the mentally impaired and has 125 buildings, many of them in good shape, on a 1,600-acre plot of land. A good amount of that is farmland, still used for work therapy by some STS residents. Residential cottages that resemble group homes, community group homes actually, scatter the campus. And the campus is largely self-sustained with its own power plant and septic lines. Residency peaked in 1969 when the then self-sufficient, largely campus, served a patient population of 2,300. And during the 1970s, Southbury found itself short-staffed and in need of further resources to care for the huge population it served. Nationally, though, in the 1970s, revelations were yielded about the hellish conditions at Willowbrook State School and changed national perceptions of the congregate care model. Even after the rightful closure of Willowbrook in 1987, its legacy was so ingrained into the legislative conscience that in the year previous, the state of Connecticut closed Southbury to new admissions. In the environment of moral panic following the exposition of conditions at Willowbrook, the federal government in 1984 sued Southbury over staff shortages and conditions. But in a 10-year period under the auspices of a federally appointed special master, beginning in 1996, the Southbury Training School was found to be state-of-the-art and released from federal oversight in 2006. With its sheer number of buildings on campus and renewed staff training techniques, Southbury has all of the benefits of a group home type atmosphere, where clients are able to be dispersed based on their level of cognitive functioning and enjoy community integration with the town of Southbury at large. During church services, where I've seen them myself, shopping trips, and other off-campus excursions for the capable, but the congregate economy of scale benefits of the institutional model remain. The patient population had precipitously declined until it fell to its current level of about 220 profoundly disabled individuals, some of whom have violent or deviant behaviors that I won't get more specific on, and they are absolutely horrific, some of them. I've worked with some of them. This decline has come in large part via the 1996 Messier lawsuit's de facto insistence that patients, irrespective again of profundity of need, be belligerently offered to leave the training school, in spite of the well-noted and well-vocalized wishes of families and patients. If there is any lesson from our current political moment, the most aggressive progressive actors are those who are certain that they're on the right side of history, and that their opponents are rubes or worse. The progressives' impulse to frame most every issue in the paradigm of civil rights, where one side is deemed to be on the side of the insatiable rotary of progress, and the other side is animated by an amalgam of hate, vitriol, and ill will, has derailed a potentially productive discussion about a pragmatic solution for the waiting list crisis. Today, the farm program, unique to Southbury, allows patients with maladaptive social behaviors or a predilection for physically intensive work an outlet for productivity nowhere to be found in the so-called community model. Residents work at the thrift shops on training school grounds and get routine community interactions with patrons, and while others engage in day programs with more severe disabilities in the Ernest Roselle School building pictured to my left here. I lost my place, I apologize. Many of the over 2,000 families with adult children on the HCBS waiver waiting list would jump at the chance to give their relative with more profound needs a place capable of caring for them. Additionally, STS's top-of-the-line dental facilities has been used by disabled persons around the state. And in keeping with models seen in other states that have reimagined a future for their state facilities, using STS as a community resource center, a hub of care for all of the state's disabled with specialized treatment that they can't get in the community or at your dentist, so to speak, could also provide a long-term cost saver and a pragmatic reimagining of STS's role. But this is where the rubber meets the road. Civil rights crusaders moonlighting as deficit hawks often point to the higher per-patient costs at STS as a legitimate reason not to give families choice or they send their disabled relatives. Like so many progressive movements, inclusion advocates have created a cabal of euphemisms, repeated so often that their underlying merits are never challenged. Quote, institutions, they claim, cost more than community living, always. Every person living in an institution could be better cared for in the community. And you're a bigot if you question that, by the way. As higher functioning individuals moved from Southbury into more integrated settings, the case mix effect set in. The ones who stayed behind in congregate care facilities had more profound disabilities and therefore higher costs. These individuals would cost more anywhere they go, and reopening the facility to new admissions would certainly decrease per-patient costs by taking advantage of STS's most profound structural advantage, economies of scale. The state of Connecticut commissioned studies, and this is important, in both 2002 and 2010, which both found no significant cost savings in closing the training school given its current case mix. Much of the intellectual steam for the movement against the common sense proposal is predicated on a misunderstanding of the Olmsted Supreme Court decision, which stipulated attempts towards more inclusive living arrangements for the IDD community. The nuance of this call, of course, has been predictably lost on the inclusion community. Consider the following excerpts from the Olmsted ruling. Quote, each disabled person is entitled to treatment in the most integrated setting possible for that person, recognizing that that setting may be in an institution. Some individuals, whether mentally retarded or mentally ill, are not prepared at particular times, perhaps in the short run, perhaps in the long run, for the risks and exposures of community settings. For these persons, institutional settings are needed and must remain available. For many mentally retarded people, the difference between the capacity to do things for themselves within an institution and total dependence on the institution is as much liberty as they will ever know. For some, end quote, by the way. For some, sheltered workshops in the Ernest N. Roselle School, art shows at the STS Pavilion, and weekly trips to Mass in town is as integrated a setting as they will ever be able to handle. The Olmsted decision has been hijacked by inclusion folks who claim it says something it doesn't. They falsely deem it a mandate for the immediate amelioration of institutions and liquidation of all of their inhabitants. What Olmsted actually does is call for a spectrum of care, with the full gamut of community care through congregate care being offered to families with disabled relatives, a choice that families themselves ought to be able to make, not at the behest of a 1986 appropriations bill or hectoring from their self-appointed moral superiors at federally funded advocacy groups. Meanwhile, over 2,000 adult children wait for care in community facilities, and families couldn't send their loved ones to Southbury even if they wanted to. Why can't these people have the option of choosing Southbury? Because it would potentially disrupt the unearned moral superiority of a group of lobbyists? Because a 1986 appropriations bill says so? I'm not convinced. If you look around the country, it is often Republicans and not Democrats opposing deinstitutionalization. It's an odd political marriage, obviously. Right-wingers and the residents of state facilities. This marriage, I think, occurs because of a derivative of the idea of Chesterton's fence. If you stumble upon a fence in the middle of the woods, there's probably a cogent reason for its existence that you ought to consider before tearing it down in a moral haste.
20 seconds.
Burkean notions of tradition, of the inherent value of the way we've done things, certainly flavors conservative support of institutional settings. The radicals in this debate are not the ones looking to reopen admissions to STS, but the ones championing a full embrace of the model that the state of Connecticut has never tried. I thank the Buckley program for allowing me a platform to share the intimate concerns of this population, and I open the floor to any questions you may have.
Well, I salute your obvious commitment to some of the most vulnerable among us.
Thank you.
Obviously, at Yankee Institute,
Yes.
we spend a lot of our time concerned about the costs that accrue as a result of our friends in the government unions.
Yes.
And so tell me, have you given any thought to the way that some of these ends might be achieved without adding significantly to this issue of unionization? In
Yes,
other
ma'am.
words, some way that this might be worked out that would allow STS to open in this capacity, and yet allow some role for private enterprise that would eliminate some of the issues we've seen with
Yes,
the
ma'am.
added expense?
Yeah.
Tell me about it.
So first, I actually read on the Yankee website. I was doing my homework here.
Oh,
There
good.
was, of course, there was a CT Conference of Municipalities Advocate who recently testified, I think, before one of the joint sessions and they recommended ending the process of collective bargaining for retirement benefits and reform the binding arbitration laws, regarding state
Why, yes,
union
I'm familiar
employees.
with that, yes.
And I think that's a wonderful idea. I certainly sit on the side of those looking to reform the excesses of our public unions in this state, which are obviously, as you know, the single biggest driver of our fiscal problem in the state of Connecticut, largely anyway.
I couldn't agree more.
Sure. So that being the case, and you bringing up the idea of privatization, I think that's where the nexus of Southbury as a place to care for the most profoundly disabled residents. And by the way, I think this is an important point, that even with these outrageous labor costs at the training school, the state-funded commission both found in 2002 and 2010 that even with these outrageous labor costs that I agree with you on, there's still no cost savings in closing it because of how high the need is with this population. Like, they need so much support that you wouldn't save much money, especially when you consider abating the buildings and everything like that. But further, as far as the nexus between private care and public care, I think that certainly with 125 buildings, many of them well-maintained, they run the utilities in the buildings once a month for many of them. I certainly would have no problem with, in that community resource center model, some private providers coming in there and inducing competition in that market. I would have absolutely no problem with that, and I think it would be a good reimagining of the role for Southbury.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thanks. My main question is whether you consider running against Governor Malloy. Really. I love the passion, and I mean, you obviously care a lot about this. Sure. I guess my question would be, is what happens when the beds run out? Are you creating a new guarantee through a program like this?
Well, I think that's kind of a 10,000-foot ladder question. The first question is, does the state have a role in this at all, is the first question. I would argue yes. I'm sure there are some, dogmatic libertarians in here who might not think so, but I think for me, a primary function of the state is to care for those who literally cannot care for themselves, these being a primary example of that. And I think once we grant that premise, that the state should be involved, the next question is, how do we deliver that care? And I think that the training school model allows for these economic benefits of economies of scale, having a farm on campus where you can get some of that food, having your own septic lines, having your own power plant, having all of that stuff in place. I think there's an inherent physical and longitudinal advantage to the training school that isn't found, where you have to go pay $500,000 for a group home in the community for 4 to 5 people. So,
Thank you.
Hey, John, this is great stuff when I read it the first time, and it strikes very close to home for me. My sister, we used the term mentally retarded.
Sure.
And we were a family of 5 at the time, and some people cannot. I think part of your premise is there are situations where being at home is impossible.
That's right.
And increasingly, I think we see Down syndrome people who 30 years ago would probably have a life expectation of 30 years and are now living well into their 60s at home with 80-year-old parents. So this is a really pressing moral issue, and I commend you for it. Quickly, if you don't mind.
Sure.
You are in the state senate, and you have to come up with a quick strategy for implementing your plan, which I will assume is reopening the school and filling it to total capacity.
Sure.
What is your strategy?
Sure. So again, I think that's one of those things that requires first a step back and looking at what is the optimal population size of the training school? So I've talked to individuals familiar with the director, Eugene Harvey, and I don't want to put him on the record. I was not supposed to put him on the record, so forget that I said that. But he seemed to think that the optimal patient population was about 800. Not 2,000 was too much. 220, especially the highest need folks, that's too few. So how does this actually look in the state Senate? Well, it's an appropriations bill. So, and I forgive my ignorance on the specifics of how you would, implement that, but I've spoken to State Senator Tony Wong, who is the assistant, I think, to the minority whip in the state Senate. He told me that I've changed his mind on this issue, and he would give me a platform to put this forward in front of the highest levels of Department of Developmental Services. So I'm hopeful that those with more intimate knowledge of the intricacies of state legislative procedure.
But that is the right strategy of the appropriations process.
That's right. I think it would be, because that's how it was put in. So ultimately, whether you want to, because it's something that's reintroduced every year, where in the Connecticut General Assembly, when they come out with their legislative notes, it's something that's added in as an addendum in the sections on developmental disabilities. So it's put in there every year. I don't know the voting process by which you would have to overturn that, but that's something that I have connections with folks in the legislative area who would know more about that than I would, to be frank.
It's time for one audience question. Put your hand and the mic will come to you.
No?
No questions?
All right.
You were thorough, yeah.
Please join me in thanking John.
Thank you.